All right, so getting back into the Second World War. Um, so by 1942, Japan controlled all of Southeast Asia, Burma, and the Philippines, and most of China. Germany controlled Western Europe, North Africa, and were deep into the Soviet Union. And German U-boats hunted shipping in the Atlantic undeterred, threatening the flow of supplies from the United States to Great Britain and the Soviet Union. So, at the beginning of 1942, things were not looking very good for the Allies. But they had a plan. So Roosevelt and Churchill meet in Washington to lay out the strategy for the war. They both agreed that focusing on defeating Germany before Japan. This angers a lot of the Americans because Japan attacked the United States, not Germany, so they wanted revenge. Military commanders in the Pacific agreed with the American people wanting to take the fight to Japan. Churchill and Roosevelt saw Germany was the bigger threat and decided it was Germany before Japan. They established a unified military command, the Combined Chiefs of Staff, and they would control the war effort with going to war with Japan and Germany. Every Friday, the American and British Chiefs of Staff would meet to hammer out strategy. The final product that came out of this meeting was the creation of the Grand Alliance, a partnership of nations who were at war with the Axis powers. On January 1st, 1942, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Soviet Ambassador Letonzov and 23 representatives from other nations signed the United Nations Declaration at the White House. It affirmed the principles set down by the Atlantic Charter. Each country promised to pledge its full resources to defeat their common enemies and promised not to sign a separate peace with any of the Axis powers, like World War I, where the Germans signed a separate peace with the Russians to get them out of the war. The cooperation between the United States and Great Britain was strengthened by the relationship of their leaders. Roosevelt and Churchill stayed in constant contact, sending over 1,700 letters and cables to each other during the war. The relations with the Soviet Union wasn't the same. There was suspicion, distrust. The Soviets feared the United States and feared that they would allow the Germans to destroy. Basically, they would fight each other and destroy each other, and then the United States and the British would sign a separate peace with the Germans. So that's what the Russians feared. So like we said, Germany was considered the greater threat. Japan wasn't as great as a threat because the Japanese did not threaten the Western Hemisphere. They were more interested in the Pacific. So one thing they needed to do was to keep Stalin happy. So Roosevelt wanted to assure Stalin that the United States and Great Britain wouldn't sit on the sideline and allow the Germans to destroy the Soviet Union, or basically destroy each other. FDR promised that they would open a second front to relieve the Soviets in their fight against the Germans. Now, Stalin wanted an invasion of Western Europe strong enough to draw the Germans away from the Eastern Front. Both American generals Marshall and Eisenhower pushed for a limited invasion of France in November of 42, but the British did not like this idea. They remembered what happened in World War I. Instead, the British pushed for an invasion of North Africa to be followed by attacks on the Mediterranean and Southern Europe. The battle to defend the Middle East was not going well for the British. Basically, they had hoped that an invasion of North Africa would slow down Germany's Africa Corps led by Erwin Rommel. Roosevelt accepted the plan of the British. The invasion would be called Operation Torch, and Eisenhower was chosen to command it. It's also during this time that we see the beginning of strategic bombing. The Army Air Corps bombs Germany during the day. The Royal Air Force bombs Germany at night, basically destroying infrastructure, rail yards, factories, things that would help German production in their war effort. By the end of the war, 2.7 million pounds of bombs, or 2.7 million bombs, were dropped on German cities. So we touched on this earlier. Operation Torch, November of 1942. Nearly 100,000 Allied troops land near Oran, the cities of Oran, Algiers, and Casablanca. Now, this was the first real test for the Americans. The German Afrika Korps, under the command of Erwin Rommel, had made its way all the way to Egypt with hopes of capturing the Suez Canal, but the Germans were stopped by the British at the Battle of El Alamein, and the British began to push the Germans back. On November 8, 1942, the Americans land. In February of 43, the American army, which has really not fought anybody to this time, fought the Germans and were quickly defeated at the Battle of the Kasserine Pass. Americans suffered heavy casualties and lost 50 miles of territory. The battle was described as amateurs, the Afrika Korps, or professionals, the Afrika Korps, beating the Americans. They were basically amateurs in war. But after this battle, the Army changed its command structure, and when the Americans and the Germans met again in May of 43, the Army performed much better, and the Germans were forced out of North Africa, and that basically gave a path for the Allies to invade Italy. So at Casablanca, the Great Britain and the United States said they needed more time to plan this Western European invasion, but they were going to open the second front by invading Italy via Sicily. It's also at the conference at Casablanca that the Allies said they would not accept anything but unconditional surrender of all the Axis powers. Unconditional surrender means no conditions. You just surrender. That's it. So during this time, also, this is where you have the Russians and the Germans really bloodying each other. So one of the worst, bloodiest battles in the history of, or bloodiest battles in history and of this war is the breaking of the German army at the Battle of Stalingrad, which took place from 1942 to February of 1943. The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the turning points in World War II and basically was a turning point on the Eastern Front. Stalingrad was probably one of the, like I said, the bloodiest battles actually in human history, with a combined casualties of 1.5 million. The battle was brutal, both soldiers and civilians. The goal of the Germans was to take the oil fields in the Caucasus. They needed the oil to keep their war machine going. Through the summer of 42, the Germans laid siege to Stalingrad, but the Soviets held them off in house-to-house combat, sometimes even hand-to-hand. In November, the Soviets launched a counteroffensive that encircled the German army in Stalingrad. The commanders were ordered by Hitler not to retreat, fight to the very last man. Commanders soon ran out of supplies during the harsh Russian winter, where temperatures fell all the way down to 44 below. On February 2nd, 1943, the original German force of 250,000 men, only 91,000 men surrendered to the Soviets. So while the Soviets were turning the tide on the Eastern Front, Great Britain and the United States opened a second front in Europe with the invasion of Italy in July of 43. First to fall was Sicily. The Allied forces were led by General Patton and British General Montgomery. After 5 weeks of fighting in Sicily, the island was secured, and they turned their eyes to Italy. In late July of 1943, Mussolini is overthrown, and a new leader is in place in Italy and asks for an armistice. Once again, this is a no unconditional surrender, so they did not take that. As this was trying to be worked out, Montgomery lands in Italy, followed by the Americans at Salerno. The fight for Italy is a long one and a bloody one. Hitler sends troops to try to slow down the advance of the Allies. And on June 4th, 1944, after nearly a year of fighting, Allied forces enter Rome. You can see the invasion there. You can also see the bodies there. That is Mussolini and his mistress and some of his followers executed by the Italian people. So while fighting continued in Italy, the invasion of Western Europe was being planned and provisioned in Great Britain. Basically, Great Britain was this huge aircraft carrier off the coast of Europe, so you could put airplanes there, boats, everything. It was a great place to plan an invasion from. So the invasion is planned. Spring of 1944, the invasion forces 3 million men and 6 million tons of supplies were in Great Britain and ready to go. We have the bombing of Germany, which slowed war production and was looking to basically take the will out of the German people to fight. So on June 6th, 1944, early that morning, the airborne divisions land behind German lines to cause confusion. At 6:30, the first Allied troops begin landing on a 60-mile beachhead at Normandy. This took the Germans by surprise because they figured that the invasion would actually land at the closest point to England, and they went the other way. So totally taken by surprise. After 5 days after landing at Normandy, the German defenses were broken and the Allies were on the move, and they moved pretty fast, and we will get to that, the rest of the fall of Nazi Germany, in our next segment.